Amsterdam in the 19th century is really such an interesting example of how a city and its built environment is much more than sort of meets the eye, right? It's much more than just the aesthetics of the buildings, but it's really a reflection of the social, the cultural, the economic, and especially the political context of the time in which it was developed. Just to give a little bit of a background on Amsterdam to really understand it, the first time Amsterdam went through a sort of a growth spurt was in the 17th century, which the Dutch like to call the golden age of the Netherlands. And it was basically the age where the Dutch Empire and the Dutch trading was sort of at its height. And Amsterdam was very much the center of all that trading activity. So it benefited tremendously economically from all that activity. And that's when the initial sort of canals of Amsterdam were created and where the rich merchants were having both their offices and their houses. But after the 17th century, economically, things just went downhill. And you have these 2 centuries of basically no real economic growth or economic development. And the cities slowly started to crumble a little bit. They were still using the 17th century roads and canals, which were really made for sort of horses and carriages. And that really didn't work anymore 2 centuries later. So then at the mid of the 19th century, the Netherlands, but also Europe in general, started to experience a new period of economic sort of growth and excitement. And nations across Europe started to realize, well, we're now growing economically, but we have all this failing infrastructure, and our cities really don't resemble capital cities, right? It's not something to be proud of if everything is decrepit and there's trash in the streets, etc. So people across Europe started to rethink what is a capital city, right? How do we sort of reinvent our cities to reflect this new sort of glorious period in Europe? Amsterdam at that time, and really any other European city, was really looking towards Paris. Paris was sort of the epitome of what a reinvented capital of a nation would look like. And what happened in Paris is basically Napoleon became the emperor of the French Empire, and what he did, he appointed Baron Haussmann as the prefect of the Seine, and basically giving an urban planner, a city planner, free range to do whatever he imagined was the best with the city. So Paris at that time was the same as Amsterdam, sort of decrepit infrastructure. There were a lot of slums, and they basically bulldozed through everything and created this really wide, grandiose boulevards that then always ended at a major public work, right? The l'Opéra, the Louvre, Arc de Triomphe, all these boulevards had these side axes towards these buildings. So it was really a grandiose city. If you were an upper middle class citizen of Europe and you traveled around, you went to Paris, you were wowed and amazed by this city. So then coming back to your home country, you wanted to create that as well, right? And that's in the beginning what Amsterdam set out to be. So there's a plan from 1966 that basically draws an extension to Amsterdam sort of as a mirror image of Paris. Wide boulevards, major public works, really large squares. This was really large, magnificent thinking. But the political situation in Amsterdam was very different from France. So instead of having a very central authoritarian power, the Netherlands was basically sort of a conglomeration of provinces and cities, but there was no central government to really force these kind of grandiose plans. So the original plan from 1966 basically failed both in the municipal government of Amsterdam as well at the national level. And to understand this, there was basically no way of financing it, because in France, the central government had financed the redevelopment of Paris because it was the capital of the nation. In Amsterdam, even though it's the capital, it's not the seat of the central government. The central government couldn't be seen to sort of give an advantage to Amsterdam over Rotterdam or Utrecht or any of the other Dutch cities. So that complicates things a little bit further. And then Amsterdam also had a very liberal, sort of laissez-faire political environment, and then I mean liberal in the European sense of the word. So to build these large boulevards, what you have to do is you have to basically either expropriate or buy out existing property owners, and this is exactly what happened in Paris. Whole swaths of land were just expropriated. This you couldn't do in the Netherlands because the property owners had major protection, so the only way to do it was to actually pay market price for these properties, and that the city and the central government in The Hague were never going to be able to finance. So these plans completely failed, and instead what you see is that private developers start meeting that demand for new housing, for new streets, but they build piecemeal because there's no sort of grand plan behind these like individual private developments. So you still see all the houses in that expansion of Amsterdam are individual little tracts. They all look a little bit different. And one of the ways to finance these developments was to do public works, because public works were necessary, right? So you need parks, you need, let's say, a theater building, or in the case of Amsterdam, a concert building, both as sort of a symbol within the city, but also for its citizens. You can't just only build houses. So the way they fund these public parks is through private development, but then the edges of the park is what we call the golden fringe. They're basically sold off to the richest people because they have a very nice view on the green park. And then with that money that was made by selling off the sort of prime real estate along the park or along the concert building, then the rest of the development could partly be financed. Where Paris is really sort of the pride of the nation and very much the symbol of the nation, in Amsterdam, the citizens of Amsterdam, not the citizens of the Netherlands, but the citizens of Amsterdam, are very proud of the fact that a building like the concert hall, which is actually quite an interesting and imposing sight to view, is completely funded by private capital. And this is sort of the epitome of capitalism, right? You're so rich, you can actually fund a public works with private money. So that was a major point of pride, and you see that as well in some of the parks that were created at that time. Paris actually is very similar to a lot of European cities, where in the middle of the 19th century, when you get this sort of new economic development, there's also a completely different political climate. And they want to show that in the urban fabric as well. So you kind of like almost visually break from that history and create a completely new city. And that didn't happen in Amsterdam. In Amsterdam, it was very much an extension of what was already there, and it was again privately funded. There was no public involvement in that, which is very different from a later period in Amsterdam's history, after the First and especially after the Second World War, when the state plays a very instrumental role in expanding and redeveloping Amsterdam. So that's why these contrasts in the urban fabric are so interesting, and you can kind of see the historical and the political context when you walk around in the city. But this is really why still today, Amsterdam, when you walk around in its historic core, there's curving canals, there's individual houses, everything looks a little bit different. And that is really a consequence of having a liberal, laissez-faire, decentralized government in the 19th century, as opposed to cities like Paris or Rome or Budapest, where in the 19th century, when they were going through a very similar era of urban development, they had a centralist authoritarian regime that basically made it possible to do these extremely sort of grandiose, magnificent urban redesigns that were just not possible in a city like Amsterdam.